first credited sans-serif font to appear commercially was created by William Caslon IV in 1816. This font was called 2 Lines English Egyptian, however the term sans-serif would not be used until Vincent Figgins, after creating a font he called 2 Line Great Primer Sans-serif in 1832. But what is sans-serif? What does it mean? The term sans means without, so sans-serif would be without serifs. Well then you're probably asking, what's a serif? To put simply, it's a small line at the end of a letter. Here we have a font that is sans-serif and a serif font. Serifs would be these bits in red. So now that we know what sans-serif means, we can find out where it began. An argument could be made that the first instance of sans-serif existed way back in ancient times when words were chiseled into stone. Since these words are written with strokes without serifs at the ends, they are technically sans-serif. John Soane was a British architect in the 18th century. In 1778 he was granted a travelling scholarship by King George III. He travelled to Rome where he drafted a design for a British Senate house. Included is most likely the first recorded instance of real monoline sans-serif lettering, where he used sans-serif capital letters for his titles. It could be considered the beginnings of sans-serif as we know it today. From John Soane in the 18th century all the way until the 19th century, sans-serif was used in things like shops and signs. This sans-serif signage was painted by hand or carved as opposed to printed. As mentioned in the video introduction, William Caslon IV is credited with the first sans-serif font to appear commercially. This font appeared in a book around 1816 with a font called 2 Lines English Egyptian. Caslon's font was for the Latin alphabet and only featured capital letters. The term sans-serif wasn't coined for another 16 years. In 1832, when Vincent Figgins created the font 2 Line Great Primer Sans-serif, his font, like Caslon's, only featured capital letters. 2 years after Figgins first used the term sans-serif, William Thorogood introduced his font 7 Line Grotesque, which included both capital and lowercase letters. Grotesque became a way to describe fonts in the same way serif and sans-serif are. It's worth noting that grotesque fonts are a subcategory of sans-serif fonts. They had a geometric design and simple-shaped letters with relatively even stroke weights. These fonts were usually bold because they were primarily used for titles and headlines, and the traditional serif fonts at the time were used for the body text. New fonts would emerge, but sans-serif would have to wait until after World War II before its true emergence. Initially when starting out, designers and type foundries took inspiration from the classic fonts that were already created. In 1896, the Berthold Type Foundry designed a font Accidens Grotesque, which was based on Ferdinand Feinhardt's Royal Grotesque Light. In London, 1913, Edward Johnston and his student Eric Gill were commissioned to create a sans-serif font for viewing at a distance on signs and posters. Johnston designed his font utilizing his calligraphic skills, with strokes having variations in width. The intent was for legibility. This led to the new term humanistic sans-serif. Johnston's student Eric Gill improved upon what he made and created Gill Sans in 1926, which improved the detail of lowercase letters. While Johnston and Gill were inspired by the classics, some German artists were experimenting with expressionism and more avant-garde styles. Paul Renner was working on creating a sans-serif font using only shapes. After being unsuccessful, he came up with a new design. In 1927, relying on slight stroke thickness for optical proportion, Paul Renner's Futura has cemented its place in history for the subtlety of the design, becoming a timeless font used by many brands today. To name a few, Supreme, Party City, Volkswagen, and Shell. There was a brief pause when World War II halted explorations in type for Germany, England, and the US. But in Switzerland, which was a neutral country, sans-serif styles were still being pursued. Switzerland took inspiration from the past designs and moved towards the older sans-serif styles. The Swiss Haus foundry created Normal Grotesque in 1943, which used the font Modern Grotesque from 1912 as its inspiration. After the war, Max Medinger, a Swiss typographer, created Helvetica, inspired by Haus Grotesque from 1912. Medinger's inspiration Haus Grotesque was based on Accidens Grotesque. Despite very minimal differences between the three, Helvetica was heavily marketed as an improvement as well as safe and neutral. It was heavily marketed in general. Major success of Helvetica and other sans-serif fonts can be attributed to them being made available in era-important typesetting equipment. By the 1960s, Helvetica was nearly the only typeface used in Swiss typography in that era. Despite sans-serif font successes, they were still limited to posters and signs. These signs, however, were seen by one Steve Jobs, who thought the posters around his college campus were beautifully lettered. This interest carried over to when he would create the first Macintosh personal computer. The font he chose for the computer's user interface was based on Helvetica. Created by Susan Kerr, the Macintosh default font was called Chicago. Because of advancements in websites and the desire for more online content, designers and brands needed to adapt and appeal to the masses. The Web Open font format was released to the Open Web standard in 2009. This allowed for widespread adoption of web fonts. Nowadays, sans-serif fonts have taken over. Brands have had major redesigns in efforts to appeal to the modern era. Sans-serif fonts' neutrality and adaptability lend itself perfectly to today's cultural and political climate.